Greetings, my friends. Evangelist Joey Bellmore here once again. I wanted to do an update on the Asia-Pacific region and the conflict specifically going on in the South China Sea between, most notably, the United States and China, as well as some of the surrounding nations over there as well, as I've been reporting on. And we'll start off with this piece as China has come out and they're talking about their slow but steady approach to building up their maritime influence seems to be producing results. And this is much to the consternation of the U.S. and its allies. Back in mid-October, the White House was shocked to learn that a Chinese company had acquired the right to operate the Port of Darwin in Australia's Northern Territory under a 99-year lease. And that was pretty significant development because the U.S. had been militarizing Australia and beefing up their presence in that area, and as well as many other areas that surround the South China Sea. So that was certainly a significant development. And it says here that the port where U.S. Marines are based is strategically important for the U.S. as it pursues a policy of rebalancing toward Asia to counter China's growing influence in the region. It says here, for U.S. President Barack Obama, the news that China's land bridge group had won the bid to operate the port came as a nasty surprise. In his first meeting with the new Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull on November the 17th, Obama voiced his displeasure that the U.S. had not been informed of the deal in advance. Goes on to mention how Landbridge, based in China's Shandong province, is a private company, but an Australian think tank says it has links to the Chinese military. One of the company's executives is believed to be a former military officer who also once served as a deputy public security chief of a local city. So another example of the saber rattling between nations and the strategic military positioning as the U.S. has been dabbling in Australia, and now we see China as well trying to secure that as a point of their military strategy for this region. And speaking of military strategies of China, we have seen them revamping completely their military as they seek to modernize their military. And we're seeing this, the beginning of this in this piece here, which the title reads, China creates 3 new army units to modernize its military. And this is just more of the same as we see China continuing to develop its military as it's becoming one of the world's strongest forces now. And it says here that China has created 3 new military bodies as part of reforms to modernize its military, the world's largest standing force, and improve its fighting capacity. According to state television on Saturday, they showed President Xi Jinping giving military flags to the leaders of the 3 new units: a general command for the People's Liberation Army, a missile force, and a strategic support force. At the ceremony, which took place Thursday, Yi and the People's Liberation Army officers and soldiers sang the national anthem. And so this is another piece that I'll go ahead, link you up with, but another indication of China's military overhaul and their strategic military endeavors that are consistent with the ongoing intensification of military conflict worldwide in many different regions, which will only intensify as these signs of the times continue to unfold in these biblical end times in which we live. And another piece here talking about this major military restructure for China, as it goes on to talk about how China unveiled these 3 new units that I previously mentioned in the last piece. And it talks about these specifically in this article, but it mentions that they're going to create, as we had looked at, a force to oversee strategic missiles, an Army General Command, and a strategic support force. And this is according to the Chinese state media. Now, it mentions that President Xi Jinping described the modernization reform as a major policy decision to realize the Chinese dream of a strong army. It says the new units, along with the building of a second aircraft carrier, come at a time when Beijing is being more assertive in territorial disputes in the South China Sea and East China Sea, escalating tensions with its neighbor and with the United States of America. Also, a part of this overhaul, as this piece alludes to, is the Chinese military launching 2 new wings for space and cyber age, as President has urged the Army to adapt to digital era as Beijing sets up separate command for land forces. It says that China has officially launched 2 new wings of the military and established a separate command for ground units as it presses on with a massive overhaul of the armed forces. The Central Military Commission also released a guideline on Friday aimed at driving the rest of the reform program. And so it talks a little bit more about that, but it mentions that the Strategic Support Force, previously mentioned, would be responsible for high-tech warfare in space and on the internet. And so those are just 2 of the types of warfare that are going to be fought in these times, my friends. They mention space warfare. They mention cyber warfare. Of course, there's the literal military physical warfare. We have got economic warfare going on. We've got, of course, there's, for those of you who know a lot about the military's patents of chemtrails and weather geoengineering, we've got weather warfare. There's many different types of warfare that are going to be fought in these end times, and space and cyber warfare are just 2 of these that we're going to see coming to the forefront, I believe, as time progresses on here. So in the midst of all this strategic military restructuring and positioning by China, we see here that in this piece, the South China Sea tensions are surging as China has apparently landed a plane on the artificial islands that are highly disputed. And it says here that China's first landing of a plane on one of its new island runways in the South China Sea shows Beijing's facilities in the disputed region are being completed on schedule, and military flights will inevitably follow, foreign officials and analysts said. It goes on to mention that as we see here, so you can read it, China's increasing military presence in the disputed sea could effectively lead to a Beijing-controlled air defense zone, they said, ratcheting up tensions with other claimants and with the United States in one of the world's most volatile areas. Chinese Foreign Ministry officials confirmed Saturday that a test flight by a civilian plane landed on an artificial island built in the Spratlys, the first time Beijing has used a runway in the area. Vietnam launched a formal diplomatic protest, while Philippines Foreign Ministry spokesman Charles Jose said Manila was planning to do the same. Both have claims to the area that overlap with China. And we've talked about that, how Vietnam, Manila, and other surrounding nations have overlapping claims to these disputed islands over there. And it says here that in Washington, State Department spokesman John Kirby came out and stated that China's landing of the plane raises tensions and threatens threatens regional stability. Senator John McCain, the chairman of the influential U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, criticized the Obama administration for delaying further the freedom of navigation patrols within 12 nautical miles of the islands built by China. China has been building runways on the artificial islands for over a year, and the plane's landing was not a surprise. So we see that it goes on to talk more about how this will increase the tensions over there, and just more signs of the fact that this is one of the most volatile areas in the world right now. And here's a piece talking about how the Chinese are actually going to land a military aircraft at this new airport in the disputed area of the South China Sea in the coming months, according to an ex-People's Liberation Army officer. It says a new airport in a contested part of the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea will soon be used by military aircraft to conduct test flights, probably within the first half of the year, according to a retired Chinese major general. And it says here, civil aircraft completed 2 test flights on Wednesday at the airport on Fiery Cross Reef, known as Yangshu Reef in China, amid Japanese, Vietnamese, and U.S. concerns over the landing of another plane there last Saturday. And it goes on to mention how this retired Major General, Zhu Guangyu, said the airport would mostly serve civilian purposes. Mostly. See how they worked in there? Oh, mostly serve civilian purposes, such as rescue work and the transportation of goods, but it could also be used by military aircraft to patrol the volatile South China Sea. And in this article here, we see it talking about some of the protests that have been held over the Chinese plane landing on the artificial island in the Spratlys. And it goes on to say that tensions are rising between China and its regional neighbors after Beijing tested out a runway on one of its artificial islands in the South China Sea. A civilian plane landed on a runway on Fiery Cross Reef in the Spratly Islands, one of many islands and reefs in the South China Sea claimed by China and other Asia-Pacific nations, including Taiwan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Vietnam has lodged a formal diplomatic protest with China over its action, while a spokesman for the Philippines foreign minister said Monday it was planning to take similar action. So one of the things that you can clearly see here is the tensions between the surrounding nations and, of course, the U.S. and China, all escalating, and this thing seems to be heating up more and more each day as provocations continue to be launched by not only China but the U.S. as well and other nations in the area, as I've reported on. And so we had mentioned how these protests were launched against Beijing's plane landing over there in the Spratlys, but according to this piece here, Beijing has rejected a protest from Vietnam after a Chinese plane landed on the contested reef in the South China Sea, saying the operation took place within Chinese territory. And this latest spat came after President Xi Jinping's visit to Hanoi in last November, mending fences with the neighbor who, from time to time, engage in bitter dispute with Beijing over the South China Sea. China has asserted its claim to almost all of the South China Sea by rapidly building artificial islands, including airstrips said to be capable of hosting military jets. And I wanted to put this in here because I've been showing you in recent reports that I've done on the Asia-Pacific region on how Japan is becoming involved in the Asia-Pacific disputes, even down in the South China Sea. And in this piece, we see that U.S. is moving advanced ships to their Japan base. And this is talking about the North Korea nuclear threat, which is also another dynamic in that Asia-Pacific region that is further igniting conflict. As it says here, the U.S. guided missile destroyer USS Wasp, which took center stage geopolitically last October for sailing within 12 nautical miles of artificial islands built by China in the South China Sea, departed from a U.S. Navy base in Yokosuka, Japan on Wednesday to be replaced by a more advanced ship as part of the Navy's plan to put the latest, most capable vessels in the Asia-Pacific region. So the Navy is going to put their latest, most capable, advanced vessels down in the Asia-Pacific region for a reason. because this thing is escalating and escalating and escalating. And what we're seeing now is nothing compared to where this conflict is headed. And we're going to see that, as this is one of the major tension points around the globe right now over there, along with, of course, the Middle East and other areas that I've been talking about in my videos. And so it says here the Lawson had been based in Yokosuka, for 10 years, protecting the aircraft carriers USS Kitty Hawk, George Washington, and Ronald Reagan, as well as carrying out freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. The Lawson will conduct her last patrol in the Western Pacific before heading to her new home port of Mayport, Florida, according to the Navy. The Lawson's replacement, the ballistic missile defense-capable USS Barry, has been retrofitted with the Baseline 9, the newest Aegis combat system, and will arrive in Yokosuka this spring. So after we see that the U.S. is moving their most advanced naval ships to the Japan base, we have more news here regarding Japan. As it says here, Japan threatens East China Sea stability as they plan to drive away Chinese naval ships. So we see this ongoing increase of military activity and saber rattling among nations over there in the Asia Pacific. As it says here, Japan plans to use self-defense force units to drive away Chinese naval ships from waters near the disputed Diaoyu Islands, a move that experts say will break the currently controlled status quo and may lead to escalated tensions or even open confrontation in the East China Sea. Analysts have also said that Japan may want to play up East China Sea tensions to suppress the domestic opposition before its controversial security bill comes into effect in March. Responding to Japan's warning, China's foreign ministry spokesman Hong Li said Tuesday that China's resolve in upholding territorial sovereignty is unswerving when it comes to the Diaoyu Islands, but urged Japan to exercise restraint. It says here, an escalation of tensions in the East China Sea is the last thing we want to see. We are willing to properly manage and settle the relevant issue through dialogue and consultations, Hong said. The status quo in the East China Sea has been controlled so far as both China and Japan have dispatched only Coast Guard vessels to patrol the area, a situation that will change once Japan dispatches military vessels, analysts said. And this is exactly what they're planning on doing when you read this article, which I will share with you. And while it states here that the status quo in the East China Sea has been controlled so far, when you read this piece in its entirety, you're going to see that Japan actually is intending to drive away these Chinese naval ships, as they're going to be increasing their militarization in that particular region, if you will. Now, in this piece from globalresearch.ca, we see more of how China's growing naval power is going to confront these Western threats posed over there. As it says here, the analysis and intelligence is continuing to study the balance of powers in the Indo-Asia Pacific region. China has already contributed and is contributing many resources to the modernization of its navy, as we've looked at in this report here. The growing Chinese naval power is the main reason of the U.S.'s attention to the South China Sea, and the whole American policy aimed to restrain the Chinese expansion in the region. In turn, without a powerful navy, China won't be able to continue to pursue their own geopolitical goals and defend crucial maritime routes. And in this next piece, we see that Beijing actually may impose an air defense zone, Manila has warned, and it says here, Beijing's next move in the South China Sea could be to establish an air defense identification zone. Unless its test flights to a man-made island elicit some pushback, the Philippines' top diplomat said on Thursday. China last weekend, as I've reported on here in this piece, they landed a plane at an airstrip on the Spratly Islands, and the runway is on one of the 7 islets created out of reclaimed land in the disputed area in the South China Sea. Chinese state news agency Xinhua on Wednesday reported 2 additional landings by civilian airliners. Vietnam, which claims Fiery Cross Reef as part of its territory, condemned Beijing's actions as a violation of its sovereignty. So we're seeing more and more people coming out and speaking out against this, or more and more leaders of the nations that surround the particular region over there in the China Seas. And it says that the Philippines is very concerned about the flights. Foreign Affairs Secretary Albert Del Rosario told a joint news conference with his British counterpart, Philip Hammond. If this is to happen, and if this is not challenged, we will have a situation where China will take a position that could be imposed. Del Rosario said, noting the possibility of either a de facto or official zone. This will be deemed unacceptable to us, he added. The Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam all have claims in the South China Sea, and I believe there's other nations that have claims there as well. But it says China insists it has indisputable sovereignty over much of the sea, and officials have previously said an ADIZ could be set up if Beijing deems it necessary. In 2013, it established an air defense identification zone over the East China Sea. Japan and the U.S. have refused to recognize the zone. So think about what that could happen, or what that could cause to happen. If China goes out and they implement this air defense zone, and other nations don't recognize it and they go in and fly in there, that could lead to military conflict. Similar to what we've seen with Turkey shooting down the Russian plane, a similar event could happen if this situation continues along this path and China does impose this air defense identification zone. In fact, Republican lawmakers are actually using Washington's dispute with Beijing over the South China Sea as an opportunity to call for a stronger U.S. Navy. So we're seeing these military shows of force, the saber rattling between nations. We're seeing threats, a war of words, if you will, between the leaders, and we're seeing China growing their navy and growing their military, restructuring the whole thing. Now we're seeing calls for the same to occur in the United States. And it goes on to say here that Speaker of the House Paul Ryan on Thursday said tensions with China highlight the need for a strong navy that can serve as a deterrent. He criticized the Obama administration for proposals that would reduce the U.S. naval fleet. And this is a quote from Paul Ryan here, the Speaker of the House, and he said, "This just shows that we need to have a strong Navy," Ryan said at a news briefing. "We should not have a president proposing to lower our ship count to pre-World War I levels. This means we need to have a strong military and a strong Navy and a real foreign policy, which we do not now have." And this, of course, comes on the heels, as I reported on, of several Chinese civilian planes recently landing on the islands that Beijing has constructed over in the disputed South China Sea. More on Japan here, as they are going to expand their military presence in the South China Sea amid these tensions with China, as this piece alludes to here. Goes on to say how Japan is set to boost its presence in the South China Sea here in 2016, with Japanese anti-submarine reconnaissance aircraft making transits in locations along the South China Sea waters. Japan's defense ministry and self-defense forces have allowed the country's P-3C patrol aircraft to stop at bases of countries facing the South China Sea when returning from anti-piracy activities off the coast of Somalia, according to the Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper, which quoted Japanese government sources. The newspaper said the move will allow Japan to support U.S. patrols around the islands in the South China Sea. And this last piece I'm going to finish off with here talks about how the South China Sea crisis and how it's behind the scenes more of a battle for oil and other reserves that are in the South China Sea. And it says here in this piece from globalresearch.ca, talking about how a long brewing crisis of both regional and global proportions has been festering in the South China Sea in recent years, between claimants to a variety of islands, reefs, and shoals, and more importantly, access to oil and natural gas resources that are worth trillions of dollars. Although this dispute, or more accurately put, many individual and interlocking disputes, have gained in importance in recent years, they have been a bone of contention for centuries. The discovery of vast stores of oil and natural gas and the assertiveness of a resurgent China have brought a long dormant dispute back to a level of international importance. It says here the dispute may be broken down into three main areas of argument. The first is the matter of delineating territorial waters and economic exclusivity zones for each individual nation that borders the South China Sea, and how these areas may often overlap. The second issue are the legal rights to exploration and exploitation of oil and natural gas, mineral and renewable resources in the overlapping economic exclusivity zones, as well as the international sea zone that lies outside territorial and economic exclusivity zones zone areas. And of course, the third matter of contention is the free passage of international commercial traffic and warships through United Nations delineated international waters. So we just see how this has the potential to just blow up, for lack of a better term, over there in the South China Sea. And while all these territorial disputes are interlocking claims among many nations over there, when you look at how there are trillions worth of dollars of oil and natural gas resources and different reserves have been discovered over there in the South China Sea, you could see that this could be an underlying reason for the contentious and provocative behaviors of these nations to assert their sovereignty over that particular region. And I presume we're just going to see more of the same continue to increase and just accelerate and escalate over there in the Asia Pacific, specifically in the South and East China Seas. And at the end of the day, my friends, like I always say, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but that's what we do here. We're looking at these signs of the times. And this is some of the signs of the times that Jesus said would occur before his second coming. He said there would be nations rising against nations, wars and rumors of wars, kingdom against kingdom. And we're seeing the beginning of the intensification of these crises and these tension points around the globe that eventually will all culminate in a climax of biblical proportions. And that's why it's so important to get right with God and to make sure that you have Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior of your life, and that you're living for him, and that you're born again. Because Jesus said himself in John 3:3 that unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. So you must be born again. And don't let, Jesus also said to not let these things that we see in the world today, these signs of the times, he said, see that you're not troubled in Matthew 24, for all these things must come to pass. And this is what we're going to see, my friends, increase wars and violence and lawlessness. As I mentioned before, we're seeing the moral collapse of society, not to mention economic collapse, which is in the very near future, droughts and famines and earthquakes and other natural disasters, disease epidemics, plagues and pestilences, and these are some of the things and some of the signs of the times that we're seeing intensify here. So it's more important now than ever to take the time to open your heart and mind to the reality of the existence of a true almighty creator God, and that there was only one God, and he preserved one book for us to see what he thinks about everything, to show us how to live, to show us how to get to know him and develop a relationship with him, and to get born again by the power of his Holy Spirit so we can experience eternal life through Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, and no man cometh unto the Father but by him, just like he said in John 14:6. So, my friends, I'm going to close with that. Until next time, I'm Evangelist Joey Bellmore. Seek Jesus today. That a Chinese company had acquired the right to operate the Port of Darwin in Australia's Northern Territory under a 99-year lease, and that was pretty significant development because the U.S. had been militarizing Australia and beefing up their presence in that area, and as well as many other areas that surround the South China Sea. So that was certainly a significant development. And it says here that the port where U.S. Marines are based is strategically important for the U.S. as it pursues a policy of rebalancing toward Asia to counter this the beginning of this in this piece here, which the title reads, China creates 3 new army units to modernize its military. And this is just more of the same as we see China continuing to develop its military as it's becoming one of the world's strongest forces now. And it says here that China has created 3 new military bodies as part of reforms to modernize its military, the world's largest standing force, and improve its fighting capacity. According to state television on Saturday, they showed President Xi Jinping giving military. Greetings, my friends. Evangelist Joey Bellmore here once again. I wanted to do an update on the Asia-Pacific region and the conflict specifically going on in the South China Sea between, most notably, the United States and China, as well as some of the surrounding nations over there as well, as I've been reporting on. And we'll start off with this piece as China has come out and they're talking about their slow but steady approach to building up their maritime influence seems to be producing results. And this is much to the consternation of the U.S. and its allies. Back in mid-October, the White House was shocked to learn security chief of a local city. So another example of the saber rattling between nations and the strategic military positioning as the U.S. has been dabbling in Australia, and now we see China as well trying to secure that as a point of their military strategy for this region. And speaking of military strategies of China, we have seen them revamping completely their military as they seek to modernize their military, and we're seeing China's growing influence in the region. It says here for U.S. President Barack Obama, the news that China's land bridge group had won the bid to operate the port came as a nasty surprise. In his first meeting with the new Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull on November the 17th, Obama voiced his displeasure that the U.S. had not been informed of the deal in advance. Goes on to mention how Landbridge, based in China's Shandong province, is a private company, but an Australian think tank says it has links to the Chinese military. One of the company's executives is believed to be a former military officer who also once served as a deputy public